What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? And I don't know if we're live on Suris' channel yet.
We should be live on both channels.
Okay, awesome. Cool. So, yes, tonight we are going to be having a discussion between Suris and I. We're still having my live stream at 8:30 p.m. Central Time after this, but I figured we could spend about an hour and a half discussing Suris' video this week about Jesus historicity. So, Suris, I really have to say thank you for talking with me on this subject and discussing your video and everything like that. I find that there's not a lot of people that want to discuss this topic, so I really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Not to mention, I figured that it's a topic that for some reason it seems that the atheist community in general gets behind just because they think that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if you've noticed this, there seems to be an inordinate amount of atheists that think that they have to be mythicists or they have to be historicists. Wow, brain. Because you have the one side that goes, well, we have to agree with the scholarly consensus because that's what we do for evolution. And then you've got the other side that goes, okay, yes, but if I agree that Jesus is a historical figure, that's me being one step closer to Christianity. And I think both sides are wrong. But is that a thing that you've seen as well?
No, actually, I've experienced the exact opposite. Is that most people in the atheist community are of the historical mindset, and that mythicism is still a pretty, not really fringe, but minority. It's a very minority.
It does fit the definition of fringe as far as historical groups go. It unless you're mired in the story of mythicism, it is basically what we would consider fringe. It's not fringe in the way that like flat earther or something is fringe. That's a different that's a few steps to the right in the fringe category. But it is still considered fringe among historians, but not so much so that somebody who's a mythicist would be considered crazy in the same way we do so with like a flat earth or a young earth creationist.
Well, you see, a lot of people liken mythicism to being a flat earther, and they often say that mythicists are the flat earthers of the atheist community and everything like that. But while I do agree that there are some crazy ass like mythicists and mythicism ideas out there.
Yeah, they're in my comment section.
Yeah. um, I come from more of the minimal mythicists, which I know is sort of a phrase that Richard Carrier has put out there, but it's more based on actual reasoning around the evidence for Jesus and not the wild harebrained ideas that a lot of people come up with.
Yeah, it's not the
S is a horrible source to use for anything, and the Zeitgeist movie is an embarrassment.
Every single time I've seen this happen several times, where somebody will say Horus meets all the criteria for Jesus, and when they say that, they send that meme. I'm sure you've seen it, the like brown epitaph that has the comparisons, and you look at it and you go, you got that from Zeitgeist. They go, no, I've never even seen the movie. I'm like, yeah, cool. That's kind of what Zeitgeist was there to do, was to make sure that information was out there so that people thought that it was originally their thought. Like, that was a movie that I watched back when I was in high school. And it wasn't good then, and it's not good now.
Right. And there's a lot. There are a lot of things wrong with it. I don't think that the Horus comparison is all that trash, because I feel like a lot of those deities that are on that list are examples of the common types of deities that were around, and I feel that Jesus is just a Jewish version of these dying and rising gods.
Well, they fit what we call a mythotype, I believe, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to kind of go through, I wanted to go through your video kind of point by point with starting at the beginning.
Sure.
And at the beginning, we start off with Josephus, right? Mm-hmm. And I get, at least I got the feeling that you were fine with not considering the Testimonium Flavianum to be like evidence for Jesus. Am I wrong about that?
That one is that book 18 or 20?
That's 18.
18. Yeah, I was from what I've been able to read, book 18 is pretty unanimously considered to be not terribly reliable and to be an interpolation, and book 20 is pretty much considered to be consistent with more of what we understand of how Josephus writes, and how he applies his bias where and when he does, because historians in the first 1,000 years from the turning of the millennium, so BC, as soon as we get BCE up, a lot of them wrote with political bias. It's not as objective as how we consider the way a historian should comport themselves today. A lot of stuff then was post hoc rationalization and running through for politics.
Right. And I've got like a whole like iceberg of reasons why the testimonium, I would say, is most likely completely like fabricated and inserted. So if we want to go into that later or something like that, we can. But if we're not going to be considering the testimonium as reliable evidence for Jesus, we can move on to the book 20 evidence that you cited.
Yeah, because I believe from what I've been able to read, I'm pretty much on board with you that book 18 looks like an interpolation. It looks like something that is definitely inserted in there, especially because if memory serves, doesn't the testimonium ingratiate Jesus a lot more than every other book that Josephus has? It puts a much more positive spin on him.
Yeah. So for the Josephus passage, there's a lot of things that are wrong with it. There's textual critics that have gone over it, and there's a lot of like verb usage that isn't the same. It's not structured the way that Josephus would structure it.
Yeah, it's not consistent with the time or the author.
Right. So there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't consider that to be a good source for Jesus. So if we're going to throw that out, we can just go ahead and address the second part.
Yeah, we can do that. That's perfectly fine.
Okay. So talking about book 20, first I want to ask, do you know how like marginal notes and like insertions worked, like when copyists were doing their thing back in the day?
Let's go ahead and move on as if I don't, which is my way of saying that I don't, but I don't want to admit I don't.
Okay, so there was, and this is mainstream scholarship, by the way, just so you don't think that I'm getting some kind of fringe thing. They never indicated whether or not it was a marginal note meant for later, just for that person, whoever was reading it, or if it was an actual, oh, I forgot this here, this has to be inserted. So there was no way for them to determine what is supposed to be added into the text and what was just a note sort of off to the side. And so this is how a lot of interpolations happen, and they're worked directly into the text. Now,
so basically a later historian or a later copyist would see the marginal note and then insert it in because that just happened to be there, and they go, oh, well, the intent must have been to put it in. Let me go ahead and take care of that right now.
Right.
Regardless of whether or not that was something that would have been good to do in the first place.
Or was originally there. There was no way for them to know what kind of thing that was. So the part in AJ 2200, the who was called Christ, is actually verbatim what we find in the New Testament. And it would be something that a Christian scholar or something like that would have written if they were wanting to remind themselves, oh, this passage right here is supposed to talk about Jesus Christ. And so then a later copyist would come in and copy it down and insert it in there because they didn't know that like that was a marginal note or something like that.
But do we have any marginal or interlinear notes in book 20 specifically? Do we have any textual evidence that was like? I understand that if that's the common method that was used, that's fine. But if we're talking specifically on book 20, is that a thing that we see? Do we see that there is in fact marginal notes that have been inserted from that book onward? Do we have evidence of that specifically?
Well, I'm fairly certain that we do. I didn't write any down here in my research for this particular section, but there in Josephus in general, there's a lot of instances that you can find where these interlinear notes were worked into the passage. I mean, like I said, I didn't write any down specifically, but it is a common thing that happens with these texts.
Well, I understand. Like I said, I understand that it's a common thing that happens in the text, and I have no problem accepting that because that's if I were to take this copy of the Gideon Bible that I definitely did not take from the hotel at Faithless Forum, if I were to take this and I were to write in a note here in Proverbs 3:4. I think that verse 6 is stupid because it says, "Do not forsake her, and she will keep you, love her, and she will guard you." And I go, well, I don't think that's a proper way to manage that relationship. Let me just insert that in there. And 1,000 years later, somebody looks at here, and this is the one copy of the Bible that exists anymore. Period. There's no way for them to know if, oh, the original author just inserted a note there. That's not a assuming that my penmanship looked consistent. So we can definitely say that that's a thing that happened, and it's a thing that we could demonstrate would happen again later on down the road. My problem, though, is that if we're talking about a specific book, do we find that specific book even has evidence of those marginal notes? I'm not saying that it's not there, but if we're going to bring up that methodology for copyists, then I would want there to be as well evidence that methodology was applied in this instance.
Right, I understand that, but you have to also understand that, like, Origen, who originally had this book, never referenced this particular passage. So regardless of whether or not there were other interlinear notes that were later interpolated into the text in that particular book, what we don't have is evidence in history of anybody knowing that this particular passage was there. And Origen is known for using Josephus for other things, but when it comes time for him to pull out this particular reference of a Jesus who was called Christ, he just simply doesn't.
Fair, but if memory serves, when we're talking about Book 20, he's specifically just using the title that many people gave to Jesus at that time, because at that point Josephus was writing, 40-ish years after the death? Like, he was writing a little bit after the fact, so he would have pretty much just been grabbing the title that people were commonly using, a Yeshua ben Joseph, who also was called Christ by his followers. This would be fairly consistent, marginal notes or not, just grabbing the title that his followers were using, because there's not really. So, for instance, if we look at Jewish sources of the time, if we look at the Mishnah or the Tosefta, which are both from 200 BCE to 300 CE, or one's a little earlier than that, we find that there are references to, at the very least, this cult around the 1st century. And in those references, there's no point where it says that, oh, the cult leader never existed. It accepts a Jesus as a historical fact, and it accepts that his cult, because these are Jewish documents, it accepts that his cult was also responsible for a great deal of persecution of the Jews at the time. So even with marginal notes, even with all that, what we have is one historian, Josephus, who, bias or not, does write, or it seems to be writing, for a Jesus who is considered a Christ. There were multiple people who were considered Christ at that time. It was just a title. Who was considered a Christ, and we have Jewish documents that also corroborate this for around that same time as well. That seems to be mildly consistent with, at the very least, having a historical figure, one of possibly many if we take, say, the legendary approach, that this Jesus would have been based off of. Because I think you and I both would agree that the Jesus depicted in the Bible is definitely not what we're looking at, because there's no point that you or I would agree that this person turned water to wine. There's no point we would agree that this person reattached an ear through essentially magic, and there's no point where we would agree that this person came back to life. But it doesn't matter if the actual text on the person, what they're saying about the person, is accurate or not, because the person they're talking about, from what we can tell, did at least exist, even if 90% of what was written about them was a lie.
But you see, I don't think so, because I feel like that particular Jesus originally was the Jesus Ben Damnius that is later mentioned in the passage.
Why do you think it's Ben Damnius, though?
Well, for one thing, I mean, Ben Damnius is the one that is mentioned in this particular paragraph, but also there's like you mentioned how Christ is a title, and I completely agree, and that's actually going to play a pretty big role into my Tacitus discussion that we'll have here in a minute. But there's no callback like or explanation as to who like what this Christ was or who this Christ was, because the audience that Josephus was writing to would have been a Roman audience, right?
If we're talking for Tacitus, yes.
No, not
Oh,
Tacitus.
for
For Josephus.
Josephus. Well, Josephus was a Roman slave. He was a Jew that was brought, a person from Judea who was brought in as a slave and then worked as a historian. So he would be writing for a Roman audience, yes.
Right. So, I mean, he would have to somehow explain it. Like, for instance, in that very same AJ 2200, he makes a callback to who the Sadducees are, indicating that they've already talked about them. So, if, these are the same people that we're talking about, but he makes no kind of callback for this Christ that he's just sort of pulling out of the air here.
So doesn't the when he mentions a James the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ, isn't Ben Damnius mentioned after that? The particular passage for Ben Damnius, it follows it later.
Right.
Because you and I can at least both agree that Josephus does not write about one Jesus. He writes about at least three, possibly more.
At three Jesuses. What do you mean?
You've never. That's actually talked about even in Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, that there are at least three Jesuses that Josephus throughout his works talks about.
Oh, sorry. I thought that you were talking about in that one paragraph.
Oh no, not in the one. I didn't mean that he inserted all of them in like one giant Jesus orgy. No, no, I'm just saying in general, Josephus did not speak about just one Jesus. We can admit at least that he speaks about multiple Jesuses throughout his works.
Yeah.
Okay, so with the Jesus Ben Damnius argument, Josephus exclusively relates people by parental heritage, at least in the chapter there before, because I believe he has a different set of writing. He has a different writing for parental heritage and a different writing for hyperbolic brotherly stuff. When he's mentioning the apostles, he has one set of words he uses for, and these are the brothers of Christ. Then he has one set of words that he uses for Josephus, not Josephus, for James specifically. Correct? Because he doesn't word them exactly the same.
Well, he doesn't word who exactly the same. Sorry.
Okay, so Josephus in writing, when he's referring to the apostles, when he says things like these are the brothers of Christ, he refers to that completely differently than when he talks about James. In James, when he says James the brother of Christ, I believe that the verbiage is different across the two, correct?
What, you're talking about Josephus?
Yes, when Josephus is writing about James. His writing on James as a brother seems to denote more of a biological brotherly set as opposed to hyperbolic being a hyperbolic brother.
Oh, well, yeah, because in this particular instance, the Jesus has a brother named James, but it's Jesus Ben Damnius.
But how do we know that
Jesus,
it is
the Christ?
How do we know that it is Ben Damnius? Because he's specific. I believe the phrasing is James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Correct?
No, it was. Hold on, I've got it written down here. So let's see. It says, so Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others.
So is this speaking of a Damnius, or is this speaking of a Jesus who they considered to be holding of the title?
Well, in my opinion, the who was called Christ is the interpolation, was the marginal note that later got written in.
But again, you said earlier that we don't have any evidence that we have evidence that marginal notes were a common occurrence, but we do not have evidence that there is a specific marginal note here that had to be inserted.
Well, I think that evidence of the marginal note is the fact that the who was called Christ is structured just like a marginal note would be. It also is verbatim part of the New Testament, and I believe it's like Matthew 1:16. at the very end of Matthew 1:16, it has that exact, like in the Greek and everything like that, it's the exact same structure and everything. So it would be known to a Christian scholar that was reading through it. And so like it just doesn't make sense to have like this particular Jesus or whatnot attached to this particular James, because
So
it
in when we're talking about Matthew, for one, it doesn't mention James, but that's not terribly important here. It
well,
does
no, I
say,
didn't say that it did. I said that it uses the who was called Christ.
yeah, it
It
uses like Jesus, who is called the Messiah. But is there, so if there is a New Testament passage that granted, the New Testament passages have anonymous authors. We don't know who wrote any particular one of them, and we can't really pin them down. But I don't think there being a consistent sentence structure between how Josephus writes on the matter and how it's written in the New Testament, for better or worse. I don't think having a consistent sentence structure is a point against or for. That seems to be a bit of a red herring.
No, I don't think that it's a red herring, because it's structured just like interlinear marginal notes would be structured. Like it's a participle phrase.
So is it a marginal note in the original text for the New Testament as well?
Well, no, it's
So
not a
then why would it
marginal
be
note there,
consistent?
because it's an integral part of the sentence structure.
So how
With
is it not an integral part of the sentence structure when Josephus is writing? If you use an idiom from what was it? If this is Matthew, if we take Matthew, do you accept a 70 AD Matthew?
this what the 70 80 Matthew? What?
Because I know that Carrier has, what is it, like a 30 something AD for Mark, or a 40 AD for Mark, like a 70 AD for
Oh,
Matthew and Luke, and then
well, no, no,
a
no.
little after.
No, no. Mark is in 70, and then Matthew would be in 80, and then Luke is mid 80s to 90s.
Okay, and then around what
And I mean,
time?
that's not just Carrier though.
I understand it's not just Carrier. There's like six prominent mythicist authors on this.
No, 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 no. The dating of the Gospels is not a mythicist thing.
I'm
That
not
is
saying that
a
it's a mythicist thing.
scholarship thing.
I'm saying, do you also agree with the one scholar who's going to be most pertinent throughout this conversation is going to be Carrier, not because this lives or dies on Carrier's work. I don't think that it does.
Okay.
I'm just saying that, do you agree with, because he's one of the ones who's managed to popularize that to the layman. So we have an audience who also are going to know those datings from Carrier over anyone else. If there's any amount of scholars that people are going to know within this conversation, Carrier and Ehrman are probably going to be the ones that people know the most. And then I wouldn't call him a scholar on this, but Habermas would come up later. But I can't stand Habermas. Minimal facts is stupid.
No, yeah, Habermas is trash on historicity.
Yeah, we both agree on that. I cannot stand him whenever I've had the conversation with somebody who is a minimal facts person, and they say, well, do you accept these minimal facts? I go, it doesn't matter if I accept the minimal facts. Do we use that method to determine historicity of any character ever? Well, no, we don't. Okay, cool. So you're special pleading. Excellent. We can now move on. Gary Habermas doesn't matter. So if we have a Matthew that's written in 70 to 80 AD or 70 to 80 BCE, around what time would Josephus have been writing originally?
Let's see. Josephus, I can't remember the exact date. I'm wanting to say that it's around like 90 or so.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
So is it a terribly hard stretch to take, if we accept that Matthew was written between 70 and 80, and just a decade or two afterwards we have Josephus's writing? Is it terribly hard to expect that he would have taken the idiom himself, as opposed to there having to be an interpolation? These two things are almost contemporary.
Well, no, I mean, there were obviously people using the Christ title by that time. I mean, Paul was writing in the 50s, so the Christ word, I mean, was being thrown around. But you see, my argument doesn't hinge on that. My argument hinges on the fact that it makes no sense to connect Jesus Christ to this particular James, because this particular James doesn't die in any kind of way that is known in Christian theology. So it doesn't make any kind of sense to
does he need
state
to
it there.
So does Josephus write about how James dies?
Joseph or Josephus writes about how this James died.
And does James die in Christian theology? Does he die in the New Testament?
Well, I mean, he dies in Acts. He's described as dying in Acts through, I believe it was stoning, or no, by the sword.
Yeah,
and then in this one
he
stoned.
had James, but the James that died in Acts was brother of John, correct?
Well, I mean, James the Pillar is a brother of John. Yes.
Okay, so we have two different. We have a James, the brother of Christ, written by Josephus, dying differently than a James, the brother of John, dying in Acts. I think
well, no, the James that's in the New Testament is the same James that I mean that Paul talks about in Galatians 1:19. Or well, okay, so in Galatians 1:19, Paul is talking about a general Christian, which we can get into later if we can make it that far. But the James the Pillar, which is who it seems to be talking about here. I mean, you have to understand they die in different ways.
I mean, they do die in different ways, but from what it looks on the text, it also seems like they may just be different people. It seems like we have to do a lot of reading into these two characters in order to try to synonymously throw them together as the same person. Not to mention, we do agree.
I thought that you were making the case that this James that's right here is the same James the Pillar.
No, I'm saying that the James, brother of John, that died by the sword, which if we're taking Acts, we know that there's seven. We know that there's at least 7 letters that were written by Paul that are true, and 5 that are interpolations. Correct?
Well, sorry, I didn't catch that. What?
So when it comes to Paul, we have 12 things written by Paul in the Bible. 7 of them we accept as most likely being written by Paul. 5 of them we don't accept as being written by Paul. Hold on. So give me 1 second. 10 by... Trying to remember which books we actually have as written by Paul that are correct here. 7 books are undisputed. If you allow me just a moment here. Trying to see here. Because I know there's 7 that are not disputed. Okay, so... It's credited with Hebrews. The letters, there would be 14 books in total. Okay, so I can't find the ones that are actually considered undisputed. So if you know the ones that are undisputed off the top of your head, that would be awesome, because I do not remember. I'm fairly certain that I used to know, but... Okay, so the letters from Paul that we consider authentic seem to be 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. The ones that were pretty evenly divided on are Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. Okay, so Acts is not one that's... Who was the author of Acts? Is that Luke?
Same person that authored Luke.
Okay, so that... yeah, Luke Acts. Okay. And do we... Of course, I got somebody in the chat that just posted all the ones that I just went through. Anywho, what is your case that these two are, that James the brother of John and James the brother of Jesus from Josephus? What is your case that these two are the same person? That's the first part that's important.
No. I mean, I'm not trying to say that they are the same person. I thought that was the argument that you were making.
No. My argument is that the James brother of John that died by the sword, dying differently than the James and Josephus, is fine, because there does not seem to be a reason to think that these two are the same person.
Okay. So, but you're saying that the James and Josephus is the same James as the one in Galatians 1:19.
Look up Galatians 1:19 real quick, because I am not a good Christian. I'm not a Christian anyway, so it doesn't. Okay. So Galatians 1:19.
Actually, it's a pretty good move to go to Galatians 1:19, because we've been on that first Josephus thing for about half an hour, but
this lets us get away from Josephus for a minute.
Yeah, so this
Um,
part in Paul, where it's actually the next point that you make, that Josephus and Paul were writing about James being a brother of Jesus.
yes, and so when Paul's speaking, he says, "I saw none of the other apostles, but I did see." He makes an exception. He goes, "But I did see James, the Lord's brother," and he refers to him. There's not a real good way of determining whether or not he means him as a brother in the way that an apostle's a brother, or a brother in the way that someone is genetically a brother. With Josephus, we seem to be able to read into it and find that, but with Paul, it seems a little harder to do so.
Well, yeah. So I was actually going to push back on this part because the that particular one 19, it's not clear. The original Greek word is adelphos, and
Mm.
adelphos can mean either a sort of religious kinship or it can mean a blood brother. And since
Yeah, and
there's no
that's why it's harder to tell what specifically Paul is speaking of there. But I don't think that it's terribly much of a stretch in either way, because if James is considered a spiritual brother of Christ, or he's considered a biological brother, the case is stronger with biological brother, because if we can get a Paul saying no, I'm not saying that the case is that that's the case. I'm saying that we have a 50 split, and the case for historicity would be stronger if we could pin down that he's talking about a biological brother. If it's an ethereal brother, if it's a religious kinship type brother, then you've got a 50-50 chance of it actually being the biological brother there. If we're just taking standard decision theory, where you have to take a 50-50 split when you don't know, at that point we still have a 100% chance. If we're taking decision theory, we have a 100% chance that it is the correct James that Josephus is talking about if we take biological brother, and the if we take the religious kinship brother, we have about a 50-50 chance, which means that our set now has a 75% chance that this is the same James.
Okay, I understand that, but I don't feel like you're factoring in how or the theology behind Paul and the title "Brother of the Lord."
Mm-hmm. The decision takes that as a 50-50 split either way.
But I mean, you have to understand that it. I guess I can understand that position, but you have to understand that brother of the Lord, like everybody that's a baptized Christian is a brother of the Lord. It's part you become part of
Yeah,
the
my
Lord's
my
family.
argument didn't rest on that. That's so with decision theory, when you have the two things, when you have a chance of it being, when you have just as much of a chance of it being the biological versus it being the ethereal, you take the 50-50 split. That's how things work into, like, it's weird. I know that you and I probably disagree on whether or not we like James for modern day debate. But he did a whole decision theory thing on Pascal's wager. I think that the entire thing was BS because the numbers were pulled out of the butt. But the point is that decision theory ends up coming down to a lot of 50-50 splits, and then you have to evaluate from there. So if we take that, okay, there's a high chance that this is biological, and we take there's a high chance that this is ethereal, even if he's referring to James in the ethereal, that doesn't mean that that's a guaranteed this is not also the biological James, correct?
Well, I would say that the passage is vague enough to where you can't tell between the two.
That's why, okay, so that's why there's a 50-50 split. So,
No, I agree with at best it's a 50-50 thing, but that also means that you can't use it as evidence for a biological like brother of Jesus, and therefore you
but
can't use it.
are you familiar with how we factor things in for decision theory as an example?
Uh, I guess talk to me like I don't know.
Okay. The same thing that I said earlier when it comes to the marginalized notes. Okay, so for decision theory, when we can't determine something one way or another, or for us to determine something one way or another, we'd have to pull the numbers out of our butt. We use the 50-50 split, and then we have a 50% chance, or a 50% leaning on one decision and a 50% leaning on the other. And then we have to factor in another decision and see if it carries some of the same connotations. So, for instance, let's take biological James. If it is guaranteed that Paul is talking about a biological James, because the word can mean either biological or religious kinship. If the word means biological, as we look there, we have a 100% chance that this is, or we have close to 100% chance. Nothing's 100% in history. we have close to 100% chance that this James is James, the biological brother of Jesus, and we can go from there. The other side of the coin would be the 50% chance that Paul's talking about an ethereal brother or a religious kinship brother. So we have our 50-50 split right now, right? We have biological, we have ethereal. Okay, so when you look at the ethereal side, when you look at when we look at James, brother of Jesus, we're talking about him in the religious kinship way. Would James, even were he considered biological brother, also be considered a religious kin of Jesus?
Well, I mean, he would. Well, I mean, if it's the fictive kinship, then I guess so.
Okay, so, but if when we refer to him, like for instance, I was going to say something and then my brain immediately went, "Hey, buddy, you've only been awake for an hour. Don't think about that anymore." But when we look at the second set for the decision, the second set shows a 50% chance again that this is biological or a 50% chance that this is ethereal. Because even if he's referring to ethereal, that does not denote that he is not also biological. There's nothing about him saying this person is also a religious kin of the Lord that says that this person is not also biological, because we're talking about James. The same way we'd be talking about Mary as a religious kin. She would not stop being biological kin. She would be both. So we have a 50-50 split again, correct?
Well, I mean, you would have a 50-50 split again, but you would also still have more, like, even if you cut that half, into half, like on top of the already 50%, you still have more of a percentage that it's a fictive kinship than
no,
it would be.
that ends up being more of a percentage for biological kinship, because when you take that second set, when you have a presently set 50-50 split, and then you have a second set of a 50-50 split here with the ethereal, you have your. I wish I could do share screen right now so I could do it. This works so much better with a graph. Just imagine a circle graph here. There's a 50-50 split in the middle. Ethereal, biological. In the ethereal side, even if we accept the ethereal side, it does not denote that the negation, the biological is not a negation of ethereal, nor is the converse true. They can both exist simultaneously. So if he's talking about ethereal, it still does not negate the fact that he could be talking about biological. So we have to cut that in half again, which leads us to 75% chance of biological.
Okay, so I guess I would disagree on this point because of the fact that brother of the Lord is an actual title in Paul's theology. Mm-hmm. So, like, if it wasn't for that fact, I guess maybe I would agree with you on this point. But the fact that it's an actual title in the cult, and this brother of the Lord James is not. Okay, so another thing that factors in here is the fact that Paul never talks about Jesus's family whatsoever. Like, he even goes through and he lists all the different types of people that are in the faith, like all the different levels, and he does not list like brother, like he doesn't list like the family members of like Jesus or whatnot.
True, but but Christianity did not have a biological component. So we know that there are some like polytheistic religions around the time that had a biological component. If you didn't share a certain amount of not that they could really tell genetics at the time, but if you didn't share a certain amount of genetics with other polytheists, then you would be ostracized there. But Christianity didn't work that way. It didn't have a biological component. So the mere fact that he didn't mention a biological component for the hierarchical structure of the faith, it doesn't say one thing one way or another.
Okay, my opinion on this particular one, the 119, is that it doesn't help historicity or ahistoricity. And while it may be the strongest evidence for a historical argument, I still don't think that it actually proves that Jesus was a
it doesn't prove Jack. You and I agree on that. This comes down to even if I do the 50-50 splits through with decision theory, that still only gets us to 75%. Like, that still only gets us to a 75% chance that this James is the biological brother of Jesus, which would lend more credence to that Jesus being real, because that's when we do history, degrees of separation are important. So if you're separated by 12 degrees via either family or time, then we view your articles as much less important. For instance, King Arthur doesn't have much written on him until several hundred years afterwards, and what we get is spotty. So, the more degrees of separation that we have, the less we rely on them as being historical fact. With here, though, we seem to only have a couple of degrees of separation.
Okay. Well, I mean, what do you mean by a couple degrees of separation?
So if we let's take a historical Jesus. Let's pretend a historical Jesus existed. 1 degree of separation of him would be James, and then 1 degree of separation away from James would be Paul, which would make Paul have 2 degrees of separation from Jesus.
Okay.
Whereas if we're dealing with a character like, again, King Arthur, if we've got 12 generations after the supposed Arthur protecting the Anglo-Saxon tribes and leading to the establishment of Britain, if we take that entire legend, we don't get much writing on that until several generations afterwards, at least 12 degrees of separation. This is why we can look at someone like King Arthur and go, could there have been a person who that legend was based off of? Maybe, but the chances are really slim at that point. Whereas with Jesus, we only have a couple of degrees of separation between people who we would consider his contemporaries.
Well, yeah, but you also had Paul not like specifically saying that he only had revelation of Jesus, and that he looked to the scriptures to know things about Jesus.
True, and that's why he can't be 1 degree of separation from Jesus, because he never met him. He would only be 2 degrees away.
Well, no, I mean, he specifically says that scripture and revelation is the only way to know anything about Jesus.
And at that point, he's speaking mainly as a theologian, I would believe, because at that point, Jesus is already dead. Like, whether they considered him risen or not, he was definitely dead. So the only way that they would have even been able to convince anybody that, hey, here's how you know things about our Lord, is you say, hey, how does a mystery cult function? Oh, but the only way to know is by joining the mystery cult. If we accept that Christianity began as a mystery cult, then that's consistent with it. That's just consistent with how a mystery cult functions. It doesn't say anything for historicity or for ahistoricity. That's just how a mystery cult works.
Well, no, I understand that, but I mean, if you have people that are in the cult that actually knew the person that was supposedly started the cult or whatever like that, I mean, wouldn't you like have people that could correct you on your bullshit at the time?
I believe that around that time, Paul had already spoken to Peter. Correct? He had already taken his run to Peter and gotten his information from him. As far as he's concerned, at that point, he had not.
No. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, he is only there to confirm the gospel that he's already preaching, not to get new information. And he several times in his writings, he states that he got his information from no person on earth. He only got it from revelation from Jesus and from the scriptures. So he did not, at least on Paul's account, he did not talk to anybody. He did not get his information from anybody. He only confirmed the gospel when he got to Jerusalem with Cephas.
Allow me one moment just to look something up real quick. Okay. Okay, so we have... is this what I'm thinking it is? Okay, so... Did at any point Paul try to figure out, or did at any point Paul try to actually change his mind on how the Gospels worked, or did he just go to affirm things, like at any point during his travels?
Well, I mean, I'm not all that learned on Paul's complete travels or whatnot, but from what I know about Paul's theology is that he only received his information from Jesus through revelation and through scripture.
So what happened during the incident of Antioch?
What happened in Antioch?
Antioch was when Paul and Peter had their dispute. He talks about this in Galatians. Galatians 2:11 through 2:14 if you want to look it up. But apparently there is some evidence that conflict happened. James D.G. Dunn says that Peter could have been a bridge man between Paul and James's opposing views. I'm not saying that, him being a scholar on here lends any merit one way or another, but there does seem to be some conversation as to the conflicting views that Paul had with James in this instance, and Peter trying to bridge those and end up coming to verbal blows with Paul as a result. So we look at that reference in Galatians, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James and used to eat with the Gentiles, but after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So, if you, through a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live as the Jews do? There seems to be an actual moment here where these two are having a conversation as to how best spread. It's not strictly on Scripture, but it is definitely on the best method to communicate Scripture to the Jews.
Well, yeah, but how is this any kind of information about Jesus?
Because here we have confirmation that we still have... We have one confirmation that he's getting information about the Scriptures from more than just Revelation, because he's straight up coming to blows with Peter. 2, we also have an instance here where James is a center point of this conflict, and if we're going to have a big part of this conversation hinge on James, the brother of Jesus, then center points that involve James are going to end up being important.
Well, yeah, but none of this is actual information about Jesus. Like he's arguing with Cephas because he feels that Cephas is doing wrong, right?
He thinks that because Cephas is not living in a way that he would consider living like a Jew, then he's not communicating to the Gentiles that they must also live like Jews. He's basically telling them to practice what he preaches.
Well, right, but none of this is information about Jesus.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be. When we're dealing with historicity of a character, things that are tangentially related are going to be important as well. So we agree that James's relation to Jesus is important. This is a direct confrontation between two people that James is actively a reason for instigating.
Well, I mean, this would be James the just, right?
This would for this one, are they talking about James the Pillar specifically?
Well, yes, that's Cephas, James.
Yeah, that's right, because he says that he's strictly in the wrong.
So I mean, this is they're in an argument about how to do things, but I mean, this isn't information about Christ or his teachings. So I get that you think that it's important because we have a link to James here, but you have to understand that when Paul is talking about how he gets his information about Jesus, it never comes from like human people on earth, and this is not anything that is a teaching about Jesus or information about Jesus.
Even if it isn't information about Jesus, though, we still have a conversation about doctrine dealing with James. I would be perfectly fine ceding the point if that is necessary, but at the same time, it still seems like, for instance, if you and I were having conversations, and we're contemporaries of, say, let's say Godless Cranium, and you and I are having a conversation about what Godless Cranium said to do to promote his channel, and you and I disagree on what he said to do for promoting his channel, this argument would start to seem pretty silly if Godless Cranium, who we are contemporaries of, didn't exist. Would you agree that that's the case?
Well,
even if he was dead.
No. I mean, I think that if we both think that this person existed, I mean, I would think that if we both already thought he existed, regardless of whether or not he actually existed, I think that still makes sense. And I think the fact that nobody is there to objectively say, well, no, that's not what he said, then, I mean, and we're all just arguing based on our opinions about what he said or what he meant. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't see how that's in the positive for historicity.
Because when you have people who are discussing, let's say Godless Cranium was leader of a cult, and then that he died tomorrow, and then one of us one of us thought that he came back to life. No, let's not do that. That would be silly. For us to be having this conversation, we have to at the very least agree that this person exists for this conversation to have any merit. These are contemporaries that do not dispute that this person existed. They would have every reason not to, especially because Jewish tradition at that time wasn't very friendly towards the Christians. They'd have every reason to deny the historicity of their cult leader, because that would be fastest way to pretty much destroy that cult. Oh, your cult had a leader. Well, that leader didn't exist, and here's why. There's no cult without a leader. This is, though, not a thing that Jewish historians or even any Jewish literature at the time tried to acknowledge.
Well, no, well, okay. So for one thing, we have two Peter where they actually make up like an actual interaction with Jesus that never happened, and it's all because of the Christians being charged with following myths or whatever. So I mean that's directly in the Bible. But also, if we applied your same logic here to the Roswell crash or any other UFO things, I mean, how would that pan out for those? Like, can we not have an argument over, how many aliens were recovered at the crash site?
Not necessarily. This isn't necessarily the same thing, because historical events and historical people are two different conversations. We can agree that a person existed, but a lot of the information surrounding the person can be factually incorrect, but the person themselves still exists. So when we're arguing an incident at Roswell, we're not having a conversation about the historicity of a person, a mere person existing. We're having conversation about a series of actions, and this is something that is completely different.
Well, no, because we're arguing over whether or not aliens existed in Roswell at that time, and whether there were actual aliens there. So I mean, I just don't see how the logic plays out when you compare it to other like things that happen.
So for this conversation to work, we would need to insert a third party. This third party is going to be Peter, not from the Bible. That's his last name. So we have Peter, not from the Bible. I don't know why his parents gave him that last name. They legally changed it because they were assholes. But we have Peter, not from the Bible. We would have to have a Peter, not from the Bible, who is saying that they were at Roswell at the time, and me and you are now arguing over the particulars that this third person, Peter, who says that they were at Roswell at the time, was there. This isn't a correct comparison unless we insert this third person, because here we have Paul and James in a disagreement, and the person who's trying to be the middle ground to say, no, I was actually there, I heard the guy, would be Peter. So if we're going to have this conversation over historicity of an event at Roswell, we're going to have to throw in a person who claims to have been there during the time that this was happening. It can't function with two people in one scenario and three in the other.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying that if we transpose your logic to other things that we know to be like legendary accretions or whatever, I don't see how your logic actually flows.
Well, it doesn't flow if you take a 3-person conversation and transfer it to a 2-person one. It stops flowing correctly because if me and you were disagreeing on something that happened, like for instance, if me and you disagree on let's take a dumb conspiracy. Let's take the 9/11 conspiracy for a second here. If me and you were disagreeing on 9/11 for some reason, which I don't think we would. And then there's a person who was there and can say, well, actually, I ran down the buildings. I can tell you the time exactly that something happened. Granted, there's a lot of factors that could go in there as to whether or not their story is correct, because if they go into shock, that can affect a lot of things. But when we're having this conversation about historicity, what's happening between Paul and James is a disagreement, and Peter is trying to be the bridge between these two as a disagreement. For this logic to transpose elsewhere, you have to insert that person who says that they were in fact there.
So 3-person UFO disagreements can't happen?
I didn't say
or
they couldn't.
haven't happened?
I didn't say they couldn't happen, and I didn't say they haven't happened. I'm just saying that for the logic to transpose, we have to make as many of the factors identical as possible. So just moving the
Yeah.
conversation from 2,000 years ago to now and running it with two people who were not there at the event is not going to work the same way as two people who were not there at an event. Well, we can argue that James was or wasn't, and then a person who claims to have known the person, been there at the event, etc. These things, for them to transpose, must be more identical in structure.
Okay, I feel like we're kind of going down a semantic rabbit hole trying to transpose the logic over. I still disagree that, your logic actually logically flows with the Paul and James and Cephas or Peter disagreement. But I mean, we've kind of been harping on this particular point for about half an hour. Do you want to move on to Tacitus?
If you would like to move on to Tacitus, that's fine. Although there are some other areas we could move into. We've probably got enough time for one more. It seems that we've taken about half an hour on each point.
Right.
Would you agree?
And I don't. I don't mean to like force you off of this topic.
Oh no, it's fine.
Okay.
You've got like so for instance, I have not been able to have a proper meal since I woke up. I've thrown a little like Totino's pizza in the oven and scarfed that down, and now I'm sitting here with Sour Patch Kids and beef jerky in an attempt to make sure that my blood sugar doesn't drop anytime during this. So I have no problem with this getting cut off at any point. I just know that we've probably got time for one more topic of spirited discussion. So I could leave it up to you as to whether we want to talk about Tacitus or if we want to talk about something that wasn't in the video, which may or may not be important to you. We could talk about application of Bayes' theorem, and that's entirely up to you.
Okay. Well, no. Well, I mean, I was just going kind of point by point through your video, and I believe Tacitus is the next point. Which I mean, we could. I mean, I know I could probably spend 4 hours talking about all of this stuff, so I'm not going to put you.
Yeah,
through that.
we know that. We know that we could both sit here and have this back. So here's the thing for the audience. We know that we can both sit here and have this back and forth for a long time.
Yeah.
And even so, we're still going to be friends at the end of this. So,
how
to have discussions like adults.
Yeah, exactly. I just didn't want you to think that I was getting frustrated or fed up or like I couldn't answer a particular question or whatnot. I'm just trying to make sure that we hit like a good few like points where we can talk about it. I really appreciate the discussion.
Oh, definitely having a robust discussion on this is nice. It's especially since I've been dealing with people like God's Gun, Guts, and Glory recently. This is definitely a different type of conversation than what I've been having to do on my channel lately.
Yeah. All right. So for Tacitus, the biggest problem I have with the Tacitus portion is your Van Vorst. That's who you were referencing, right? Van Vorst?
In that particular portion, I believe so.
Okay, because Van Vorst does not say what you say he says in your video.
Okay, so we're on the Christus thing. So let me go ahead and hear your part, and then I can respond to it at that.
Okay, so just starting off on the tip of the iceberg here, if I give you that on face value, Tacitus is actually written by Tacitus, which I contend that it's heavily interpolated. The best that you could say is that Tacitus just records Christians being in Rome during the burning of Rome in the 60s. And I really don't dispute that idea. And the fact that Tacitus was in regular contact with Pliny the Younger would give him the kind of information that you have in Tacitus, even given at face value. So I think there's plenty of options for Tacitus to come about the information about the Christian religion for him to be able to work it in there the way that it is worked in there. But even Van Vorst, the person that you referenced, does not actually agree that this particular portion says that Jesus existed in history, because quoting from Van Voorst's book Jesus Outside the Bible, it says, as R.T. Rance concludes, while the evidence from Tacitus corroborates the New Testament's accounts of the death of Jesus, by itself it cannot prove the events happened as Tacitus has been informed, or even the existence of Jesus. This latter, France correctly argues, has abundant persuasive evidence in the New Testament. Tacitus, careful historian that he was, presumed the existence of Jesus and had no reason to doubt it. So this is Tacitus getting information about the Christian cult or the Christian religion and presumed that this person existed in history and therefore wrote as such. So this isn't actual evidence that Jesus actually existed. This is only evidence that Christians existed in Rome in the 60s, and I really don't have a problem with that being a thing.
Okay, but you do. So if you take Tacitus on his own, then I would agree with you that simply a person saying the cult, like we say let's say tomorrow, the flying spaghetti monster religion actually becomes its own full-blown cult and it has 2 billion people following it, we wouldn't then say, oh, well, there is a cult, therefore we definitely have to say that the leader of the cult is there. That's not the case. But Tacitus simply saying that, hey, a person named Jesus, or a person named Christus, rather, was executed, that doesn't say a whole lot against historicity. That's just him being that's basically just him being a historian, and a hostile one at that, making a point that at the very least the cult leader who he's naming as Christus as his title existed. And even Van Voorst doesn't leave out the possibility of dependence of Tacitus and other classical sources on Christians. He holds that outside the New Testament there's still a small but certain corroboration of New Testament historical traditions and family backgrounds. So Van Voorst still ends up being fairly on the side of historicity at that point.
Well, I don't disagree that Van Voorst is on the side of historicity. What I'm talking about specifically is the use of Tacitus. Because if you could establish that Tacitus had independent accounts of these things, then you could definitely say that this proves that there was a Jesus in history.
But to do so is to focus heavily on Tacitus as an individual without taking into account the fact that there's corroborating things that are happening here. You've got you have Peter, who we at least think existed, especially from one degree of separation from Paul, because Paul claims to have also interacted with him. We have the little bit of information from Josephus, and then you've got Tacitus, who's talking about this afterwards. Tacitus, I agree with you 100%. Tacitus on his own is not important for this. For instance, if I found a single coin that had an imprint of Caesar, we would not say that that is proof that Caesar existed. But when there's multiple things that corroborate, that's when we get to the point where we go, okay, there's a higher likelihood, because again, there's no way to determine 100% anything in history. We just have to go with there's a higher likelihood that this person existed. So we have a historian who has any... You're saying we don't?
No, I'm saying that regardless of how many sources you have after the initial source, you still only have one source. That's basic historical research.
Is that basic historical research? Is that what?
Yes.
Is that the method that historians use?
Yes, because it doesn't matter
and
how
is that
many
the reason why there's a consensus amongst most historians that Jesus did exist?
Yeah, well, okay, funny that you bring that up, because the consensus prior to the consensus changing over Moses and Abraham and all that was that they existed, but then they discovered more evidence and they turned that consensus around. So the fact that there is a consensus does not solidify that Jesus actually existed in history. It just means that there's a group of historians that agree, and as long as you can provide counter evidence that's good enough, it'll eventually change.
Okay, no. So you're correct in that there is consensus that Moses and Abraham do not exist. However, the mere fact that there are a couple people who are prominent figures in the Bible who we can determine through consensus more than likely did not exist, does not necessarily mean that the same must hold true going on down the road. This doesn't, for instance, we would not say that, oh, well, why do you think that Paul existed? Well, we don't have anything that says that we have writings that are supposed to be attributed from Paul. But you don't say that a couple historical figures within the same narrative likely don't exist when these historical figures are several generations before who we know as Jesus.
I don't see how this particular part links back to what I'm saying.
It does. It does actually, because if Abraham and Moses existed, would that mean that Christ definitely existed?
No, I didn't. No. I was talking about the use of consensus, like because a lot of historical proponents use the fact that there is a consensus as evidence that Jesus existed.
I'm not using it. Okay, so that would be what we call the genetic fallacy. That is determining. It would also be an appeal to authority. That would be determining the truth value of a claim based on the source of the claim. Historian says X, therefore X must be true. We both agree this is fallacious and it's a bad way to go about things. My argument was not and is not that historians say X, therefore X is true. My argument is that you said that we use X methods, and X methods lead us to Y conclusion. Historians use X methods, yet historians have not come to Y conclusion when we're talking about Jesus. This isn't even tangentially related to scholarship on Moses or Abraham. They are separate historical figures, even if they are in the same narrative. So if we have the same historical method being used that is determining that historians find that Jesus more than likely existed, why do they find that he more than likely existed? What is the reasoning behind them determining that?
Okay, I get what you're saying, but that doesn't tie back to what I originally said, because what I originally said was it doesn't matter how many different copies of something you have, if it's all based on one previous source, you only have that one previous source, and this is basic historical research, like method. Like if you have one account that was written in the 50s, like Paul, then you have the possibility of Paul's theology, his writings and everything like that, it affecting other accounts when they're so far down the line, like with the Gospels. See, that's why I really only consider Paul to be the best source for anything that we know about Jesus, because he was writing in the 50s, and then about 20 to 30 years later, you have the Gospels being written. Well, that's more than enough time for Paul's writings to be in circulation and to be affecting the Gospel writers at that time. So just because you have like multiple copies or things that are being derived off of earlier sources, those later sources do not actually count as individual sources. They count as one source, but because they're all being derived off of the one source.
So they do count as individual sources, and they do count as corroborative, but they do not count as independent of one another. Because we would agree, for instance, that when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with the exception of John, but John's weird as fuck. It's very magical. We agree that there's at least 40% shared doctrine between the three first books, and then when you get to John, it's magic and unicorns and weirdness. I guess that makes sense. Hi, John. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But so we agree that these things share a lot of stuff, but they are still considered independent sources there. They're considered individual. They are considered individual sources that corroborate one another. They are not considered independent of one another. Basic historical methodology is we don't care if something is independent. We care if there's individual things that corroborate.
Whoa, did you just say that in historical research we don't care if there's independent accounts of things?
I'm saying that it doesn't say whether one thing is historical or not. If you have individual corroboration over 100 years, for instance, that, for historical methodology, lends credence to a higher probability of the person existing. Independent or not, that still ends up functioning.
Yeah, but I mean that doesn't like if you have one source that claims that somebody exists, and then all these other sources, quote unquote sources, use that one source, then you only have one source. Like, okay, so let me give you a for example, right? So in examining the Testimonium Flavianum, there's this one argument that says that there's a redacted version of the Testimonium that actually dates back to Josephus. But Alice Wheely, she actually did an analysis on the sources or whatnot for those particular redacted versions of the Testimonium, and there's a Arabic version and a Syriac version.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those sources trace back to Eusebius, and since they trace back to Eusebius, that still makes their sources Eusebius. So Eusebius is the only source there for those two things. So you can't say that those two corroborate the fact that Josephus actually wrote a redacted version of it, because the closest or the most that you can trace them back to is Eusebius. And so you really only have Eusebius's version of Josephus. So while, like, for instance, the Gospels may corroborate the theology of Christians at that time, it can do nothing to corroborate the fact that Jesus existed. It doesn't pile onto it. Like, it doesn't help the historical argument that those four different things exist.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but when we have, like, as an example, let's say that we have... My brain just had a fart. Okay, so let's say that there is one person who says that X happens. This happens 100 years ago, 200 years ago, doesn't matter. And then we have a few individual witnesses who see that happened, but they write about this at staggering times, 5 years off of one another. If these things are consistent with what is being said there, do we instead have multiple individuals that are writing on the same instance, or do we have people copying each other, even if they're writing several years several years staggered off of one another?
Well, no, okay. So you're saying that if you have a group of people that witness an event and then they staggeringly write about the event?
Yes.
Okay, but that's not, I mean, you were harping on me earlier about not having an appropriate analogy, and now you're using an inappropriate analogy here, because that's not what the Gospels were. The Gospels are not eyewitness accounts.
No, we agree on that, because they're written far on after the point. But my point is that when we have the same thing happen for a verbal tradition, because a lot of stuff back then was still more verbal, people didn't record everything in the same way we do now. Even historians, as we agreed earlier on, wrote with political bias. The entire idea behind getting information down as accurate was a little different and a little swayed compared to how we look at it today. If you have those individual verbal cases that say that, oh, well, Jesus at the very least existed, and you have that happening multiple times, and this is where you get writings on it later from Paul and moving on to the other epistles, then would you not count those verbals as the original?
Well, I mean, you don't really have evidence of the oral history that existed prior to that. I mean, you can suppose some things are verbal, but I mean, you don't really have direct evidence that they actually are verbal.
So we'd have no evidence, even with a Christian cult, that there were people speaking about a Jesus. We would have no evidence when there was a cult that existed before Paul that people were verbally speaking about a Jesus.
What I'm saying is that you can't discern between just mere belief that he was in existence and an actual existence.
Okay, so
like,
if
how
you and
would
I
you discern between those two?
You can't really discern between the two, but when you're dealing with historicity, if multiple people in a region believe that a person existed, the only thing we can do outside of having a time machine is to go and look at what people believed about the people that existed around them. And if they believe that that
Okay.
person existed around them, then we accept that there's at least a higher likelihood this person existed. Otherwise,
Okay.
we would have to be skeptical of every person who existed in history ever and pretend that they
Yes,
did
we
not
are.
exist.
No,
We
yeah, I mean,
Yes, we
any
are,
any
but we
good
don't
hood.
make this case for somebody like Alexander the Great as an example.
Well, but I mean, I mean, you can show how he existed, and everybody in history. I mean, I would hope anybody would be skeptical of the things they did and the very fact that they existed. But see, the point is that we actually have evidence of those people existing, whereas with Jesus, I don't think that there's
We have
any direct
contemporary evidence
evidence
of
that,
Alexander the Great.
huh?
We have contemporary evidence of Alexander the Great,
Well, I mean,
written
you're
before
kind of twisting
100.
things around there. I didn't say like contemporary evidence
You
because if we want to talk about standards of evidence, I mean that's a little bit complicated of a thing because like, you can have people that are quoting or writing from things that are not extant anymore, but they would be considered viable sources, even if that's the only ones that we have. But even then, we don't have a clear picture as to what was actually originally written. We just have to trust that that person correctly copied the quotation from whatever they were writing for. We have that multiple times in historical studies where somebody has quoted from a book, and the only reference that we have is that person's quote.
mm-hmm.
But we know that they were writing like around the time that somebody was writing or something like that, or somebody existing rather. So I mean, honestly, I've kind of forgotten what got us on to this particular tract.
We started on Tacitus. We got to Van Vorst, and then from Van Vorst, I think we hopped down a rabbit hole, and one of us hit our head. And I'm not,
Yeah.
and we landed at the bottom of the rabbit hole, but I'm also not sure who landed first, so I'm not sure which one of us is accidentally copying a feel. But I know that we're at least at the bottom of the rabbit hole.
Well, okay. So from what I can from what I can gather, I accept independent accounts of things as being good evidence for those things either happening or existing. But you seem to not require independent accounts. You seem to be fine with just a general agreement upon people that believe that something happened.
Believe that a person existed, not that something happened.
Well,
Actions versus existence.
I'm just talking about history in general, like something happened or somebody existed or
Well, the two
like
are
that.
the two actually are very different things, though. The reason that matters, you're aware of what is it called? Raglan. I'm sure there's another.
Rank Raglan,
Rank Raglan.
hero type.
Yes. So you're aware of how that's used, correct?
Well,
This
I
is
mean, I know that it's used to like rank the classical hero type,
yes.
like who fits that particular character model.
Yes. So with rank Raglan, do we determine historicity of a person or historicity of action? Or do
Well,
you know
no, I mean,
if it
I mean that would, I mean that the rank Raglan is a basically a character model that
Mhm.
models the different the classical idea of a hero in
Mhm.
literature.
And you are aware of what happens with so for instance, I know that your argument doesn't rely on carrier, and I don't claim that it does. But for instance, carrier uses rank Raglan to rank Jesus as over 11 on the hero type scale, and that's one of the things that leans him towards Jesus being mythical. Would you do you agree with that particular analysis?
I think that the fact that what we know about Jesus matches the classical hero type is a good indication that at least the information that's given about this Jesus character in the Bible and in Paul's writings and everything like that is a made up figure. But I don't think that the rank Raglan like hero type is in itself a nail in the coffin for historicity. Like,
Well,
I
I don't
don't
think
think
it's a
that it
nail in the coffin
proves
at
he
all.
was definitely not in existence.
No, and using this is the. I'm glad that you said that, because as Alan Dundas notes with rank Raglan is used to determine the historicity of events surrounding a person, not necessarily whether the person existed. And not to mention, there's 22 points on rank Raglan that can be pulled out of any number of literary archetypes. Using rank Raglan, you can actually make Abraham Lincoln score a full 22 on it, which, and at that point, we'd be determining whether or not he existed. So I'm glad that you're not thinking that anything relies on that particularly, because otherwise, the rank Raglan gets into a weird conversation about how it's misapplied.
Well, no, I mean, I think the rank Raglan definitely gives insight into like the character that's built,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that you can use rank Raglan as like a building block for saying that Jesus didn't exist. I mean, honestly, regardless of how the character's built or whatnot, for me at least, the simple fact that our earliest source, being Paul, he says that he only has information about Jesus through revelation and through scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he constantly refers to the scriptures and that the New Testament Gospels constantly cite the scriptures as their source
The
seems to
synoptic
indicate to me
gospels do
that,
not cooperate
you know,
each other. They
they
are
were
word for
just
word copies
like they
at
were hallucinating
45%
things,
to
and you know, like
90%
Paul
W,
hallucinated a
4W copy
Jesus,
in the
or
original Greek.
hallucinated a
Percent
Christ
depends
figure,
on which two
and
books you compare. They
and
do
then
not
he
support
also
each
was
other
reading
there.
the scriptures, and that's how they got their information about it. So, like,
You're gonna have to repeat the last 3 sentences because somebody sent a $10 super chat into mine, so you and the robot voice were fighting for dominance. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I was just saying that because of the fact that Paul hallucinated a Christ figure and only got his information from that hallucination or vision, revelation, however you want to put it, and scripture. I feel like with him being the first source that we have for this Jesus figure, it doesn't really help the historical like view of things. Like, I still think that there's a possibility that a Jesus could have existed back then. That's still very much a possibility.
I think the thing we'll have to end this on, not ending right now, we've still got a few minutes, but I think the best thing we could end this on is pulling the numbers out of our butts as to what percentage chance we give to a Jesus existing.
Well, yeah. For me personally, I mean, I do go with Richard Carrier's assertion that it's a 2/3 chance that he didn't exist, but I feel like for me, what puts me in that particular bracket is the fact that we don't have any independent sources of Jesus actually existing, and the earliest source that we have of him existing is from Paul. And he only cites revelation and scriptures, and vehemently argues against the fact or the idea that he got his information from human sources, which that would match up with Jewish theology, because if you got your information from human sources, that wouldn't have been very convincing.
Yeah, it's considered tainted at that point, I believe, correct?
Right. So, I mean, he would only have been able to have gotten his information from Jesus or the scriptures, which is God's word. So, for me, that's what kind of tips me over the edge, I guess, of that 50-50 decision split that you were talking about. It tips me over the edge, the fact that Paul has that particular position on, you know, Jesus existing, or Jesus and his whole manifestation.
See, for me, I'm okay. So, I think where the crux comes down to is, would you believe that there's a historical figure that existed that was the beginning of the cult, but practically everything that was written about them sans, say, the baptism by John and his execution, everything else is basically a lie?
Well, no, I mean, the baptism by John, I wouldn't say that that's a historical event. At most, that I could agree to is that there's a possibility that Jesus could have existed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, I'm just the only reason I say that is there are some New
Good
Testament.
talk, Suris. Smiley face. Pizza on me.
Casey-
Hopefully we get to see you all again soon.
Casey just did a donation to the robot voice spot. Thank you for the donation. I'm also sorry that I haven't been reading super chats as we've been having the conversation, but since we're simulcasting this to 2 channels, I don't want to do that. I can get to super chats when we're done.
Yeah.
Very quickly. But so and James Dunn is one of a few scholars, or a decent chunk of scholars, who think that the only 2 events that we can accurately show as most likely having happened when it comes to Jesus are the baptism and the crucifixion. I'm willing to just go with the crucifixion. I don't even care about the baptism because I don't think that lends anything one way or another. For me, my thought process is that I think that it's more likely that a historical Jesus existed, but a legend was built around him that is essentially all false and fabrication at this point. But that at the very least, a person was there who started the mystery cult in some form or fashion, or even was used as a scapegoat to start the mystery cult. I think there's a point where where Carrier argues that the author of Matthew seems like they're trying to take a historical figure and warp them into a hero, basically. And I would say that that's something that I could find is likely true. It still means we have a historical Jesus, just that all the actions surrounding them are false. For instance, if somebody said that Suris went to the moon, that's definitely a lie, and all the adventures that I would have to have on the moon at that point are a lie, but it doesn't necessarily say that I somehow didn't exist as a result, even though there were like a metric fuck tons of lies about me after that point.
Right. Well, I mean, for me, it still just all hinges on the actual evidence that we have, and that would be, Paul being the first one and what Paul says about Jesus. For me, I guess that would be the linchpin. And I mean, I know that you disagree that Jesus, or the Christ figure, the Messiah, being an archangel in Jewish theology doesn't seem to factor in for you, which maybe we can cover at a different date. But for me, that is a pretty big indication too, because then it's not just the Jewish Christians just making up somebody out of the blue. They were expecting it, and a lot of people.
At this point, they're attaching him onto an archetype they were expecting.
Right. And so, I mean, just all of that evidence compounded and put together, and when you consider all that, for me at least, puts me on the side of ahistoricity. But I understand that it puts you on the side of historicity.
True, and I think that just comes down to how we evaluate that particular thing. So here's my proposition. So I'm going to be doing some more videos on historicity going forward, mainly because it was requested of me a few streams ago to do more videos on history on my channel. So I'm going to be doing some stuff. Some of it's going to be like the historicity stuff, where it's nice and light, and we just go through some series of facts that could lead people one way or the other on a decision. And then sometimes we might cover something like the Desecration of Nanking. I didn't want to say the actual word that historians use for it, because that I don't know how dicey that would be on your channel. Are you familiar with that event?
No.
Okay. Don't. It's one of the worst examples of human depravity. In short, basically, Japan found a settlement in China and did every immoral human thing possible to it. Like, if you can think of a horrible thing, it was done to those citizens in that day.
Oh wow!
It's gross, but it is something that I wanted to cover on my channel, just so when somebody asks, "Hey, do you think that people are that bad?" I can go, "Well, actually, yes, I do." I think we have capacity for great horrible things. But point being, I am going to be doing more episodes on historicity on my channel eventually. As I do those episodes, I would have no problem having conversations with you about them as they come out, because I'm sure we're going to come to disagreements throughout them. So if that's something you're up for, I'm okay with that.
Okay. No, I've thoroughly enjoyed having this discussion with you.
I have as well, even if I randomly got a crap ton of dislikes.
Oh, you did?
Oh, dude, hold on. Let me go to the actual video itself, because I can't see them all in real time. Let me move on to the video and see where we're at. Oh yeah, no.
Move on to the video.
It started out with 35 dislikes before the discussion ever began, and then it moved to 75 likes throughout the course of the discussion. But those 35 dislikes happened instantaneously.
Oh, really?
It was
You
awkward.
still have the 35 dislikes on there, or did
Yeah.
they changed?
The 35
they do?
dislikes are still there.
Oh, okay. I do not advocate for anybody disliking a video just because it's a topic like this. Like I very much advocate for people to listen to both sides, and just because I come to a different conclusion than Suris does, that doesn't say anything. Like, I liked your video. I thought that, like, at every point I was like, well, I disagree with that. Well, I disagree with that. But I didn't find myself being like dislike. But even so, even if you get a dislike, I mean, that's still engagement to the algorithm.
Yeah, it's a good, like, dislikes aren't bad, and people who spam dislikes on things they don't like are just helping that channel out. But that said, I will say this. So before we move into what our percentage chances are on historicity, which I think is the best thing we could close out on, pretend it's a straight epistemology thing at that point. But before we do that, I would like to ask your opinion, because this is something that I am very concerned about. That video has a very different aesthetic look than every video I've ever produced. Should I make the next any historicity videos that I do, whether about this or Fall of Rome or anything like that, should I maintain that look?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I thought, like I said, I thought your video had a very nice look to it. It had a very good flow. You tackled, each point, and then you moved on, and, you changed up the different looks. You had the different avatars going and everything like that. I thought that was a very engaging video.
Okay, then that's what I will continue doing forward on there. I just want to make sure that if I'm going to be putting more work into an episode, because a history episode takes a lot more work to do than a response to some idiot parroting Gary Habermas, for instance. I'd like to just guarantee that, okay, people are looking at it, they are engaged. Whether they agree with me or not, I've at least produced the best video I can. So, that said, what percentage chance do you put on at the very least, a Jesus existing?
Oh, ages is existing. I mean, I'd have to stick with the 33%.
With the 33?
On a Jesus existing. I still think that there's a chance, but I feel like it's a very low chance. And even if there were a lot of Jesuses that existed at that time. I mean, even prior to the 0 AD time split right there that we work off of. I mean, there were Jesuses existing, and Jesus or the other version of it, Joshua, I mean, was a very spiritual name to the Jews. So I mean, obviously,
it's also an incredibly common one. Like 1 in 26 people in Judea had it at that time.
Right. And so, I mean, I still think that there's a possibility that it could have existed, that person could have existed or whatnot, but I don't think that we have any clear indication that would link him to the actual Christian cult that started.
Okay. And then for me, I think I sit about 65%. I was at a clear 50-50 split about a year ago. Around the time we met at Faithless Forum, actually. Because I had just read Richard Carrier's work, and I had just gone through stuff on Bart Ehrman, and I was sitting very firmly at 50-50. Now I'm leaning just ever so slightly, 65%, into historicity. Not any higher than that. I'm not gonna go like randomly full Christian. He definitely existed, and he died for my sins. Just one, I'm not a Christian, so that would be really dumb for me to do that. But. So you sit at 33%, and I sit at 65%, and that's where we sit right now in this random street epistemology joke that may or may not land.
No, yeah, and I mean, like I said before, I'm totally fine with people, thinking I'm either completely and utterly wrong. But the problem that I have with a lot of the historical argument is that they base a lot of their idea off of the fact that a consensus exists, or that historians say these things.
And I find that just as problematic as you do, because that is just that's the genetic fallacy. And that
Yeah,
bothers
no, I
the crap
agree.
out of me.
No, yeah, I'm very glad that you feel that way too, because I feel like more of the conversation should happen around the actual sources of things like we had tonight. Because I think that we had a good 30-minute discussion on each one of these things that we were discussing, and we could totally go more into it if we wanted to. But I think that we had a very good, proper discussion on it.
I do too. I enjoyed this. But that said, if you guys enjoyed it, and you guys are not subscribed, if you're looking on my channel, of course, and you're not subscribed to Godless Engineer, please go ahead and go do so. I have... Yes, I've already... I was trying to make sure that I had put your link in my description already, but I have. So we have some people who aren't cross-pollinated between the two. Go ahead and subscribe over there. And if you're on GE's channel, I'm an idiot, don't come here.
No. Definitely go and subscribe to Suris. I've actually got your video linked in the description down below. I totally think that everybody should go watch your video. Don't give it a thumbs down. It's a very good video. Just go and check it out, and leave Suris your thoughts. I saw people leaving their thoughts on your thing, and while some of them may be crazy, I thought some of them had some pretty good ones. They were the ones that you hearted though, so I think that we're probably of the same mindset when it comes to the comments.
Yeah, because even people who didn't agree with me, but I thought had a good method behind why they didn't get explained it, those were usually the ones that I was hearting through that, which is usually the case. Now, this is not the case whenever I'm dealing with something that I know 100%. When somebody says that I'm wrong on that, when somebody does that, I won't hurt the comment, because I'll just go, okay, that's fine. Usually that's when I respond to them and say, hey, we can have a discussion if you want.
Yeah, no, me too. I say that as well. But I didn't know if you had any people that were asking questions of me on your stream, because pretty much everybody that commented or tagged me in a thing was really just asking me about my thoughts on things.
So I couldn't pay attention to the chat as much as I wanted to. I saw Superchats when they came in, but for most of the chat, as that was scrolling, I realized that when it was scrolling, it was really hard for me to listen. So I ended up just looking away from the chat.
Okay.
So, but when it comes to Superchats, I am going to go ahead and go through those. I've only got a handful on mine. If you want to bounce between the two of us on Superchats.
Okay. Yeah, I've only got one. So
Only one?
Yeah.
Damn. How many viewers do you have on yours?
I've only got about 50.
Okay, I've only got about 90, which is low for me. I'm usually sitting like 200 to 300. So
yeah.
I mean, okay, that makes sense though. If you've got fewer viewers on there, fewer super chats makes sense. The first one I have is from Cy Srenka for $2. Jesus is real. He's from Iola. I met him at Mickey D's.
Let's see. I had a question in it that's not a super chat, but it's from Zero. I remember it says, one thing I want to ask, do you think non-mythicists are gullible, or do you think there's a legitimate dispute over what the facts imply here? And no, I don't think that non-mythicists are gullible, like, whatsoever. I think that they are, that non-mythicists definitely, like, there's definitely an argument to be had around this, and I definitely want to see more discussion around the topic, because a lot of people out there are like, oh, it's so ridiculous to even question this. It's like, I don't know about you, Suris, but whenever somebody tells me it's ridiculous to even question this, you shouldn't even want to ask this question, just makes me want to ask the question and figure out like what the actual evidence is myself.
Oh, agreed. That's the whole reason that on my channel I'm Suris the Skeptic, not Suris the Atheist or anything like that. It's the reason that I'll put sources. When I'm doing a breakdown of somebody's video, I'll usually just go, and I have a source for that, and there's a source for that, and in the description you'll have a source for that. Look at the historicity video for Jesus, and look at the list of sources in there. I try not to come without sources. I try not to do that, because I think by saying it's stupid to question X, it doesn't get you anywhere for conversation. It doesn't do anything functional. Except for shutting down conversation. At that point, my question would have to be, why are you trying to shut down conversation?
Yep, I agree.
So, the next super chat I have is $5 from Biblical History Skeptics. There's no textual evidence of any marginal Oh, that's the thing that I brought up earlier in there. That's just saying that there's no textual evidence for marginal interlinear notes on there.
Oh, like in Josephus?
For book 20. Book 20 specifically.
Book 20? Well, see, I still disagree that there has to be like other like interlinear notes in order for there to be one interlinear note. It just kind of seems fallacious to me.
That's fair. And the next one is also from them. It tells us Tacitus had no knowledge of a celestial Jesus by which to doubt him. Thus shows the celestial Jesus wasn't prevalent if it existed at all. That's not even a point that I brought up during it. I don't think that was a point that either of us brought up, is it?
No. I don't think that Tacitus thought about like a celestial Jesus. If anything, Tacitus thought about like a earthly sort of earthbound Jesus, but that's only because, well, like Van Voorst said, that it corroborates the New Testament and what Christians were just generally saying at the time. So at that point, Jesus had been euhemerized in my world.
Okay, and then we've got a $10 one from Jake 3D. The Synoptic Gospels do not cooperate. I think he meant corroborate each other. They are word-for-word copies at 45% to 90%. I guess the 90% would be like Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke are like disgustingly similar in the original Greek. And it depends on which two books you compare. So yeah, again, if it's Matthew and Luke, I agree with the 90%. They're eerily similar. The only one that seems to have a lot more original stuff is John, but then again, John also has the absolute most magic ever. It puts My Little Pony to shame in the amount of magic that it contains.
Let's see. My next question that I had on my stream was how many people can verify Josephus was not also fictional? I think that we have enough writings, directly from Josephus at the time, as well as other corroborating facts about Josephus to say that he actually existed. But I also think that the historicity of any historical figure would be up for question. Like I'm not of the mindset that people shouldn't question things about it, because that's the only way that you learn like the information.
True, because at that point, if I were to come to somebody who was a mythicist who just held that because, for instance, they were a Carrier fan, as an example, and I said, okay, well, why is X the case? And they said, well, Carrier says. Then I would probably sit there and laugh. Just like if you were to ask the same of me, why is X the case? And I said, well, most scholars say, then you would laugh your ass off at me for the exact same reason. I think luckily both of us managed to avoid that the entire time because both of us do independent shit.
Well, no, yeah, I agree. That both of us don't like to use the argument from authority type of argument.
Because it doesn't matter that the authority said that it's true. That doesn't say anything for good or ill. That just determines whether or not you trust that authority. Right. Then we've got the 1999 super chat from Caitlin Chloe. Good talk, Suris. Pizza on me. Hopefully we get to see you all again soon. Well, you guys don't live terribly far away from me, if memory serves.
No, just one state over.
Yeah, you're in the worst state though. You're in the worst state.
I don't know. I think there's a race between Mississippi and Alabama for worst state.
I think Alabama's currently pushing it with the girl who got shot in the stomach recently.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of that's a weird situation, but yeah, it's not very good.
No, it's not. Well, welcome to Alabama, everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Please run for governor. Make that place better.
No, I would not get voted in for governor. Okay, so I did have a $10 super chat that says, I'm not a mythicist and I've read Carrier's book. Carrier gave Galatians 1:19 more weight on historicity, but the posterior probability still gave historicity a 1 in 3 odds. And that's true. Like Carrier says that the Galatians 1:19 is the best evidence that historicists can make for there being one, but I still, like Carrier concludes here, that it still only gives it a 1 in 3 odds or a 33% chance of him being historical, and I tend to agree with Carrier's logic on
about
it.
This.
But again, like my whole view of mythicism doesn't hinge on Carrier; it hinges on the actual evidence. And I actually pull I pull from Van Voorst a lot for for looking at historical references to Jesus and what he says about them. And I look at what he says about them, and then I weigh what it actually says, and I try to figure out what I think about it.
Fair enough. And then we have $2 super chat from Biblical History Skeptics. Jesus was real. He's under my desk. Oh. Yeah, I think definitely there's some lovely filleting happening there. I've been told not to tell you that I got another super chat after that. I've been told from the person who gave it, but I think KC's in the chat, so I think KC already saw it.
I did have another super chat that is from Arduin. He just says beer hugs and beer for the both of you.
Wait, is it beer hugs or bear hugs?
Beer, comma hugs and beer for the both of you.
Oh, okay. For a minute there, I thought that was like beer hugs. Wait, what is a beer hug? Is that like a really sloppy hug where we've just got hops between us?
Yep, exactly.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I wanted to thank everybody who gave super chats to both channels because at least for me, that's quite literally how I keep my lights on. I know GE also has job as well, but definitely send stuff to him as well. He puts just as much effort into his channel as I do mine. So, with that said, I have enjoyed this conversation, and I would look forward to having another one in the future.
Yeah, no, I definitely. What next time you put out a video? Which I mean, there's still a lot that we didn't go through that you covered in your video here. This is only like minute 5 or something like that of your video.
It's almost like this is a really dense topic.
It is. It is a very dense topic. So I appreciated the conversation. I really liked it as well, and I'm glad that we could have worked this out. I've got to do an Ancient Aliens thing later on tonight, so I'm excited about that.
I think that would be too much of a headache for me.
Oh, no. It is freaking awesome. We're going to be covering cave paintings, and it's going to be funny.
Okay. Well, definitely keep me posted. Whenever you have time for us to do another discussion, probably in a few. I'm probably going to have the next video out on this topic in 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how long research takes. So we will see.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I'll be in touch with you about it, and I'll let you know.
Alrighty. Well, that's going to be the end of my stream, everybody. I don't know when GE is going to hit the end stream button for him. So
yeah, I'll hit it at the same time you do.
Yeah, at the same time? Okay, cool. Then I guess we'll just have to do... there was one question that was asked by my Metamor for you, and that was, what do you think of Jesus as a lich?
A lich? I don't know. I mean, if he actually... if he actually rose from the dead, then he would be a lich? Maybe? I think.
I would say that me personally... I don't think Jesus fits the archetype for a lich very well because a lich requires a phylactery, and there is no point in any writing that we have of Jesus giving Peter his phylactery and saying, "Please don't let anybody know that this is here, otherwise Thrall and Jaina will destroy me in Theramore."
What's a phylactery? It sounds dirty.
It does, but a lich is just a sorcerer that turned themselves into undeath. The way they do that, though, is by putting their soul in what's called the phylactery. So think Voldemort's Horcruxes. Voldemort's Horcruxes are just another name for what we know commonly as a lich's phylactery.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Jesus is Voldemort confirmed.
That might make a lot of sense. We should write a book on that.
Should write a book of Jesus as Voldemort.
Yeah. Well, for everybody that's watching my stream, I appreciate you heathens watching tonight. And don't forget to stand up, use your voice, all that kind of good shit. Everybody that's on Suris' channel right now, I appreciate you people watching, listening to my minority view of this. And I hope that you guys will tune in next time.
Absolutely.